I woke up staring at a ceiling that was way too nice for my bank account. Crown molding, a chandelier that probably cost more than my old Honda, sheets with a thread count I couldn't pronounce. I lay there for a full 60 seconds doing the only reasonable thing a man can do when he wakes up in a bed he doesn't recognize. Panic quietly and pretend I wasn't panicking. Okay. Last thing I remembered, I was flipping hash browns at Rosie's diner on the night shift. Some guy slipped on the wet floor sign I definitely put out, grabbed the fryer basket on the way down, and then everything went bright, and then everything went dark. Classic diner cook death. They'll put it on my tombstone. Here lies Milo. 3rd-degree burns. Tips were decent, so either I was dead and this was heaven's world's worst waiting room, or something much weirder had happened. A door creaked. I did the only sensible thing. I slammed my eyes shut and rasped out, "Water. Water, please," in the raggedy voice of a man who had definitely not just been thinking clearly about hash browns 30 seconds ago. It's the universal password. Works in every situation. If it's a friendly face, they bring you water. If it's a hostile face, at least you bought yourself a second to figure out if you should run. Nobody answered. I cracked one eye open. The door was ajar, and a small face was peeking through the gap. A kid, maybe 5, with dark hair combed with more care than my own head had ever seen, and eyes that were doing their absolute best to look like they weren't staring at me. That's when it hit me. A memory that wasn't mine slid into my skull like someone had shoved a USB drive straight into my brainstem, and suddenly I knew things. I knew the wallpaper pattern in this room. I knew there was a walk-in closet through that door with about 4 outfits in it, which was criminally underdressed for a house this size. And I knew, with the sick, dropping feeling of a man realizing he'd bought the wrong lottery ticket, exactly whose body I was wearing. Milo Hayes, 26 years old, orphaned young, taken in by the Sinclair family out of guilt because his grandfather died saving the current Sinclair patriarch. Married, on paper only, no wedding, no rings exchanged in front of anybody who mattered, to Nathaniel Sinclair, the coldest, richest, most terrifying alpha in Seattle, when Milo was 18 and had no leverage to say no, and the two of them had a son. Not by blood. The boy was Nathaniel's from an arrangement years before Milo ever showed up. But by law, by last name, by every piece of paperwork that mattered. Which meant, functionally whether anyone liked it or not, Milo Hayes was this kid's stepfather. And in the book I'd apparently just fallen face first into, because yes, I recognize this story. I'd listened to the audio version on double speed while doing dishes on my nights off from the diner. Milo Hayes was the villain. The bitter, petty, doomed to lose second lead, who spent years failing to win a heart that was never his to win, who got colder and meaner with every rejection, and who eventually torched his own life, and dragged the kid down with him in the last chapter. The story had a real hero, of course, some soft-spoken, luminous type named Preston, who was destined to end up wrapped in Nathaniel Sinclair's arms by the final page, while Milo Hayes ended up a cautionary tale mentioned in passing by side characters shaking their heads. I lay there a moment longer, running through the rest of what Milo's memory had handed me. 6 years of being the outsider everyone tolerated because grandfather Walter Sinclair had insisted on it. 6 years of watching Nathaniel's expression go flat and unreadable every single time Milo tried to talk to him about anything that wasn't logistics. 6 years of loving a man who had never once looked at him the way the story insisted he was supposed to look at somebody else. It was frankly an exhausting resume for a 26-year-old, and I hadn't even had breakfast yet. I sat straight up in bed so fast the kid in the doorway flinched. Absolutely not. Not on my watch. I did not survive a fryer basket to the face just to sign up for a tragic ending in someone else's story. "Hey, buddy," I said, voice still scratchy, but for real this time. "You can come in. I don't bite." The kid did not come in. The kid studied me with the exact same flat, unimpressed expression I'd later come to recognize on his father's face at 100 board meetings. Finally, he said, "My name is Elliot. Elliot Sinclair. Age 5, going on 6 in the fall, sharp as a tack, entirely too serious for a kindergartner, wardrobe that looked like it had been picked out by a personal shopper because it had. According to Milo's memories, this kid had spent the last several years getting exactly 0 warmth from either parent. Nathaniel because the man ran on caffeine and spreadsheets, and Milo, poor doomed original Milo, because he'd been too busy being heartbroken and bitter to notice there was a small, quiet human in the house who needed somebody. Well, new management. Elliot, I said, you got a stepdad now who is extremely broke and extremely hungry. What's for breakfast around here? His eyebrows, actual eyebrows on a 5-year-old doing actual expressive work, went up half an inch. It was, I would learn, as close as Elliot Sinclair got to visible shock. Quick pause before we keep going. If villain to husband glow-ups are your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe. New rebirth and transmigration stories drop every week, and this particular disaster is about to get a lot more chaotic. By the time I made it downstairs, I'd raided Milo's closet for the one outfit that didn't look like it belonged to a sad Victorian ghost, and I'd made a decision. Original Milo's ending was a slow slide into misery, spite, and a house fire nobody walked away from. My ending was going to involve considerably more chicken wings. Priorities, you understand. Elliot trailed a careful 3 feet behind me the whole way to the kitchen, watching me like I might combust. I didn't blame him. According to his memories of this Milo, combustion was a real possibility. So, I said, opening the fridge and finding it depressingly full of things that were technically food but emotionally nothing. I'm starving, you're small, and I hear there's a buffet place downtown that lets you eat until they beg for mercy. Interested? You don't have money, Elliot said, flat, matter of fact, like he was reading me a weather report. I have a card. Cards are basically money. The card has a limit. How do you know that? I do the household budget, Elliot said, with the weary dignity of a man 40 years his senior. Somebody has to. I want to be very clear that I found this deeply personally offensive. I had, in my previous life, nearly overdrawn my checking account flipping hash browns for a decade, and here was a 5-year-old who apparently balanced a household ledger before breakfast as a hobby. Later, Milo's memories would confirm there was no tragic backstory behind it, no traumatic event that forced a child into premature responsibility. Elliot was simply, infuriatingly, a Sinclair, and Sinclairs, apparently, came out of the womb reading spreadsheets the way other kids came out demanding milk. Bo had allegedly built and sold his first small app at age 9. Nathaniel had reorganized his father's supply chain as a summer project at 14, for fun. I decided, then and there, not to ask any further questions about the family gene pool, on the grounds that the answers would only make me feel worse about my own academic transcript. I stared at this extremely tiny CFO for a solid 5 seconds. Then I picked him up. He yelped, undignified, all 5-year-old again for one glorious second, and said, "Buddy, I don't care if we eat instant ramen for a week afterward. We're doing this. Grab your shoes." The buffet did in fact beg for mercy. I want that on the record. The owner, a weary, kind-eyed man named Mr. Alvarez, watched me and Elliot walk in with the specific dread of a man who remembered us from a prior life, which, considering Milo's memories, he absolutely did. Apparently, the old Milo had come in exactly once, cried through an entire plate of dumplings over some slight from the family, and never returned, leaving Mr. Alvarez with nothing but a vague, unresolved sense of guilt he'd been carrying around ever since. I resolved to fix that impression within roughly 4 minutes of sitting down. I ate like a man who had recently died and been given a second chance at carbohydrates, which, accurate. Dumplings, then the crab legs, then a truly unwise third trip to the dessert bar, while Elliot watched me with the fascinated horror of a marine biologist observing an animal in its natural habitat for the very first time. Elliot lasted 4 plates before waving a tiny white napkin flag and begging me to please stop before Mr. Alvarez cried. "You're a lightweight," I told him, patting his head. "You're going to get us banned," he said, and it was the first thing he'd said all morning that sounded like a genuine 5-year-old and not a tax attorney. We got banned, temporarily. Mr. Alvarez recovered admirably by the following month, and honestly, I respect a man who bounces back. That night, once Elliot was tucked in, and let the record show he tucked himself in, because apparently that's what happened when nobody had ever done it for him, a fact that made something in my chest twist uncomfortably. I sat on the edge of that absurd, oversized bed and did the math on my new life. Married to a man I'd never met who terrified an entire company. Stepfather to a kid who ran his own household finances at 5. Cast as the villain in a story I already knew the ending to. "Okay," I said out loud, to the empty room. "New plan. We're skipping the part where I die in a fire. We're doing the part where I eat well, raise a good kid, and figure out how not to get murdered by my paper marriage husband." Achievable goals. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. My stomach did something complicated and unwelcome. Right. I still had to actually meet the guy. In between the buffet ban and the day I actually met my husband, I got properly introduced to the house itself, which came with its own cast of characters. Chief among them was Mr. Pruitt, the family's butler, somewhere in his 60s, ramrod straight, with the kind of quiet dignity that made you want to apologize just for existing near his freshly polished floors. "Mr. Hayes," he said. The first morning he found me eating cereal directly out of the box while standing at the kitchen island. "We do have bowls." "Bowls are a construct," I told him, and he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I would come to recognize, over the following weeks, as the closest thing Mr. Pruitt ever got to genuine affection. He also, gently and without being asked, filled me in on things Milo's memory hadn't fully covered. Which fork went with which course, which room Nathaniel disappeared into when he needed quiet, and the fact that Elliot's birthday, coming up that fall, had never once been celebrated with anything beyond a card left on his pillow. I filed that one away for later. Villain's redemption arc, Item 1, fix that. Then came the gala invitation, delivered by Lawson with the grim efficiency of a subpoena, and with it, a full afternoon of being marched through Nathaniel's tailor for appropriate attire, which turned out to be code for 4 different black suits that all looked identical to me and wildly different to everyone else in the room. "That one," Mr. Pruitt said finally, pointing at the third option, after I'd tried and failed to develop any opinion of my own. "Are you sure? I liked the one that made me look like an evil butler." "You looked like an evil butler in all 4, Mr. Hayes," he said entirely deadpan, and I decided then and there that Mr. Pruitt and I were going to get along fine. I met Nathaniel Sinclair 3 days later, and it did not go the way I'd rehearsed in my head, mostly because I hadn't accounted for how much a man's presence alone could suck the air out of a room. It happened at the Chihuly Garden and Glass, of all places. Milo's memories informed me the Sinclair family had a standing patronage there, some gala for a scholarship fund, black tie, the whole production. I'd gotten roped into going by Lawson, Nathaniel's terrifyingly organized assistant, who'd shown up at the house with a garment bag and the energy of a man who'd been sent to retrieve a hostage. "Mr. Hayes," Lawson had said, "Mr. Sinclair requests your presence tonight." "Does he?" I'd said, already suspicious of anyone who talked about themselves in the third person through a proxy. I should have known the second I walked into that glass-domed room, under 100 colors of blown glass twisting overhead, that peace was not on the evening's menu. Because the first person to find me wasn't my technically husband. It was a slim, pale, achingly delicate-looking man in cream who drifted toward me like he was being blown by a very sad wind. "Milo," he said, voice trembling, with the kind of feeling that always seemed to arrive exactly on cue. "It's been so long, Preston Vale." Milo's memories delivered the file instantly. Childhood almost something of Nathaniel's. The character the book had clearly been rooting for from page 1, delicate and lovely, and according to every instinct original Milo had ever had, and that I now fully agreed with, absolutely not to be trusted an inch. Beside him, arms crossed, sneering like sneering was a competitive sport, stood a broad-shouldered man in an ill-fitting tux. "Well, well," he said. "Look who finally crawled out of whatever hole he was hiding in, Corbin, Preston's self-appointed attack dog." Also, apparently, not aware that insulting someone's gender in the middle of a sentence made you sound unhinged rather than intimidating. I opened my mouth to say something extremely calm and diplomatic, and instead said, "Wow, Corbin. Did your tux come with the rental insult script, or did you write that one yourself? Because either way, somebody should ask for a refund." Corbin's faces went an interesting shade of red. Preston's hand fluttered to his own throat like I'd physically wounded him, which frankly was the desired outcome. "You people act like the whole city doesn't know what Nathaniel's grandfather had to do to keep this marriage looking respectable." Corbin pressed on, undeterred. "Everybody knows it's just a business arrangement. Preston's the one who was supposed to." "Supposed to what?" I said. "Marry him? Because from where I'm standing, that ship left the dock about 6 years ago and you two are still waving at it from shore." That's when I felt it. A shift in the air, like the temperature in the room had dropped 2 degrees, and every conversation nearby had quietly decided to end. I turned, and there he was, Nathaniel Sinclair, in a black suit that fit him like it had been poured on, dark hair, jaw like it had been carved by someone with a personal grudge against soft edges, and eyes gray, almost black, the kind of eyes that looked at you like they were calculating your net worth and your life expectancy in the same glance. He wasn't smiling. Milo's memories informed me he essentially never smiled. He looked honestly like a man who filed lawsuits for fun. He looked at Corbin first. Corbin visibly shrank. Then he looked at me. Milo, he said. Just that. My name, in that low, flat voice, and something in my chest did a stupid, traitorous little flip that I chose to blame entirely on the champagne I hadn't even had yet. That's me, I said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere closer to deer in headlights. Up close, he was worse, or better, depending on how you wanted to look at your own imminent downfall. He smelled like cedar and clean laundry, and his tie was knotted with the kind of precision that suggested a man who ironed his own shirts out of sheer distrust of anyone else's hands near his clothes. Milo's memories supplied the detail helpfully. Nathaniel Sinclair did not like being touched by strangers, did not like clutter, did not like anything out of place, and had, as far as anyone in this family could recall, never once initiated physical contact with his own husband in 6 years of marriage. He didn't say anything else. He just stepped up beside me, close, deliberately close. Close enough that Preston's expression cracked for just a second before he smoothed it back into wounded doe mode, and set one hand at the small of my back like it belonged there. Like it had always belonged there. We were just catching up, Preston said, recovering fast, voice syrupy. For old time's sake. There aren't any old time's sake left to catch up on, Nathaniel said, and it was the coldest, flattest sentence I had ever heard delivered with a straight face. And it was aimed like a scalpel directly at the delicate white flower currently attempting to reel him back in. Milo is my husband. If either of you have business with him, it goes through me first. Preston's chin wobbled, and he reached for Nathaniel's sleeve like a man reaching for a life preserver. Nate, you remember how it used to be, don't you? Before, his eyes flicked pointedly at me. Before things got complicated. Things aren't complicated, Nathaniel said, not moving his sleeve an inch out of Preston's reach, but not letting it be taken either. You've just spent 6 years refusing to accept a very simple answer. He glanced at Corbin. And you'd know the difference between a business arrangement and a marriage if anyone had ever wanted to marry you. I nearly choked on the champagne I'd finally gotten around to picking up. Corbin's jaw worked silently, and this time it was Preston tugging him away by the elbow. The room did not technically go silent, but it felt like it did. Preston's mouth opened and closed. Corbin looked like he'd swallowed his own tongue. And me, I just stood there, this man's hand steady and warm against my back, absolutely floored, because nowhere, in any version of Milo's memories, had Nathaniel Sinclair ever once defended him. Not like that, not in public, not with his whole chest. Something shifted in me right then, low and warm and a little terrifying, and I thought, oh no. Not the he's scary kind of oh no, the much worse kind. You okay? He asked me, quiet, once Preston and Corbin had made their excuses and fled. Yeah, I said, and meant it, for the first time since I'd woken up in that stranger's bed 3 days ago. Yeah. I'm good. He studied me a second longer than the moment strictly required, like he was double-checking a fact he wasn't sure he believed. Then he nodded once, and steered me toward the hors d'oeuvres, and that was, apparently, that. The fender bender happened the following week, and honestly, it was entirely the fault of whatever deity had decided I, a man who'd never once held a driver's license in either life, needed to be behind the wheel of Milo's absurd little red sports car. In my defense, I was picking Elliot up from his very fancy new private school. Nathaniel had transferred him within days of the gala, along with a driver I kept forgetting to actually use, and I was singing along badly to the radio when I clipped the back bumper of a gleaming green two-seater at a red light. Mom, Elliot said from the back seat, already resigned, you hit someone. Mom was a compromise. He'd tried Milo, I'd vetoed it as weird. He'd tried Sir, I'd vetoed that as deeply weird. And we'd landed on Elliot calling me whatever he wanted as long as it wasn't formal, and apparently what he wanted, on a rotating basis, was either Mom or you. The green car's owner got out already yelling, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, wearing a violently orange pair of pants that suggested a man with either very good confidence or very bad eyesight. Milo's memory helpfully informed me, a half-second too late to be useful, that this particular Sinclair kept an entire closet organized strictly by color, one outfit per hue, and had apparently been working his way through the rainbow with the dedication of a man on a mission. Are you kidding me? Do you know whose car this is? Mine, apparently, since I just donated part of my bumper to it, I said, climbing out. He froze mid-rant, sunglasses sliding down his nose. Wait, Milo? Is that— oh my god, it's you. He yanked the sunglasses off entirely. It's Bo, Nathaniel's brother. You don't remember me? I did not, in fact, remember him, seeing as I was a different person occupying a body that had apparently blocked this guy out of self-preservation. But loyalty to a story I'd only half listened to on double speed only got me so far, so I went with confidence. Of course I remember you. You look taller. I'm 22. I stopped growing years ago, Bo said, deeply unbothered by this contradiction, already grinning. Half-brother. Younger, flashier, chronically overdressed, and, per the fragments of Milo's memory now surfacing, someone who used to despise Milo on principle for daring to marry into the family, and had apparently, at some point off-page, changed his mind entirely. You still owe me for the bumper, he added. I looked at his car. I looked at my wallet, which, per Elliot's most recent audit, contained roughly the net worth of a mildly successful lemonade stand. I did the only reasonable thing. I got back in the car and drove off at a speed that was, generously, illegal. We're being sued, Elliot informed me from the back seat, sounding almost impressed. We are absolutely not getting sued, I said, with a confidence that turned out to be entirely justified, because Bo, it emerged over the following weeks, found the entire incident the funniest thing that had happened to him in a decade, and brought it up at every possible opportunity for the rest of his natural life. He also, against all odds, showed up at the house 2 days later, not with a lawyer, but with a repair estimate he'd clearly padded for dramatic effect, and a phone already open to a mobile game with a leaderboard he was extremely proud of. You owe me $400 in damages, he announced, dropping onto the living room couch like he lived there. Or you owe me a rematch on this game, because I heard you're apparently unbeatable at Candy Crush, and I refuse to accept that as a fact of the universe without proof. Those aren't equivalent penalties, I said. They are to me, said, already pulling up a chair for Elliot, who climbed up beside him without being asked, clearly delighted to have found an ally in chaos closer to his own energy level. By the end of the afternoon, Bo had lost 4 rounds, eaten half our snack cabinet, and informed me with total sincerity that I was, and I quote, annoyingly likable for someone who nearly killed my car. I decided to take it as a compliment. The gala, however unexpectedly, had consequences beyond Preston's wounded ego. Word travels in circles like the Sinclairs, and within the month I found myself standing in the grand dining room of the family estate for a dinner I hadn't been informed was mandatory, until Lawson showed up at the door with, once again, a garment bag and the face of a man delivering a summons. Aunt Deborah requested your presence, he said. Aunt Deborah Sinclair, technically not Nathaniel's mother, a fact I only learned that night after several confusing minutes of assuming otherwise, but the closest thing the family had to a reigning matriarch, and a woman who had made it her personal mission for 6 years to remind original Milo, at every opportunity, exactly how little he belonged. She did not disappoint. Well, she said, the moment I walked in with Elliot's hand in mine, I see the Hayes boy remembered where we live, and brought the child along. How touching. Every eye in the room turned. Elliot's face didn't change, but his hand tightened in mine. I smiled, sweet as pie. Aunt Deborah, you look wonderful. Whatever work you're having done, I hope it's covered under warranty. Somewhere behind me, I heard Bo make a noise like a man choking on a laugh. Deborah's smile went thin as paper. Careful, dear. I remember exactly what you are. A stray my nephew's grandfather felt sorry for, who spent 6 years trying to claw his way into a family that never wanted him. You think a little wit makes up for 6 years of embarrassing this family? I think 6 years of you calling a 5-year-old's step-parent a stray at the dinner table says a lot more about this family than anything I've ever done, I said. But please, keep going. I've got all night and a very high tolerance for secondhand humiliation, as long as it's yours. A few of the older relatives further down the table suddenly developed intense interest in their salad. Bo, across from me, was very obviously biting the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing outright. Funny, I said, because I distinctly remember you not being anyone's actual mother, and yet here you are, acting like the room owes you a throne. Somebody dropped a fork. The silence that followed had teeth. Nathaniel's voice cut through it before Deborah could recover. Milo's right, he said, from the head of the table, not even looking up from whatever he was doing on his phone, infuriatingly calm. You're not my mother, Deborah. You might want to sit with that before you decide who does or doesn't belong at this table. Deborah's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I decided, then and there, that watching this man dismantle people with 6 words and 0 raised volume was possibly my new favorite hobby. Later, once the dinner had limped to its awkward conclusion and Elliot had been shipped off to bed by a relieved-looking Mr. Pruitt, Nathaniel found me in the hallway. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "Defend me. Twice now." He looked at me like I'd said something genuinely strange. "You're my husband," he said, like it was the most obvious sentence in the English language. Then, after a beat quieter, "Nobody talks to what's mine like that." What's mine? I felt that sentence land somewhere south of my ribs and stay there. I would love to tell you that things went smoothly from there. They did not, mostly because of me, and mostly because of an extremely stupid misunderstanding involving a tabloid, a phone that wouldn't stop ringing, and my own catastrophic assumption that Nathaniel Sinclair, cold and terrifying titan of industry, had decided to marry someone else. It started with a headline: "Sinclair Hair and Vale Family Set to Merge Empires?" Beneath it, a grainy photo of Nathaniel's car with Preston climbing in, angled just wrong enough to look intimate. I called him. No answer. I texted. Nothing. And here's the embarrassing part, the part I wouldn't have admitted to anyone at the time. It wasn't really about the headline. It was that some old, tired, unhealed part of Milo's memory, 6 years of being picked last, of being the arrangement nobody chose, had been sitting quietly in the back of my new head this whole time, just waiting for a reason to say, "See, I told you so." One blurry photograph, and it lit up like a struck match. By the time I'd worked myself into a full spiral, I'd already packed a bag, grabbed Elliot from school with some story about a family emergency, and bought 2 bus tickets to nowhere in particular using cash I'd been squirreling away from grocery budgeting, because apparently a lifetime of financial disaster had taught me exactly one useful skill: how to disappear cheap. "We're running away," I told Elliot once we were seated on the bus. "Why? Because your dad's marrying someone else, apparently. And I'd rather not be around for the wedding." Elliot studied me with the ancient, tired patience of a much older man. "That's not what happened." "How do you know that?" "Because I know things," Elliot said, which was, I would learn, the single most accurate sentence that child had ever spoken, and also entirely useless in the moment, because I was already committed to my dramatic exit. We ended up in Leavenworth, a little Bavarian-themed town a few hours east, all cuckoo clocks and pretzel shops and mountains in every direction, and if I was going to ruin my life, I figured I might as well do it somewhere pretty. I rented a room above a bakery with a balcony, bought Elliot a stack of workbooks he immediately started grading me on, and settled into a routine that involved considerably too much junk food and one increasingly bitter Candy Crush rivalry with Bo, conducted entirely over text, because apparently running from your problems didn't stop you from needing to beat your husband's little brother at a phone game out of sheer spite. Our days fell into an easy, ridiculous rhythm. Mornings meant pretzels the size of my head, eaten out on the balcony while Elliot narrated the tourists below, with the dry commentary of a nature documentary host. Afternoons meant Elliot's workbooks, which he insisted on grading strictly, docking me imaginary points for showing my work incorrectly on math problems I'd solved perfectly well in my head. Evenings meant takeout containers balanced on the balcony railing and increasingly unhinged text battles with Bo, who had apparently declared himself personally responsible for keeping my Candy Crush streak honest while I was on the run, whatever that meant. "You're stalling," he texted, 3 days in. "Come home and lose to me in person like a coward with dignity." "I don't lose," I typed back. "That's the whole problem with your worldview." Elliot, reading over my shoulder without permission, sighed the sigh of a boy carrying the emotional weight of 2 grown men's rivalry. "You could just answer his actual calls, you know," he said, meaning Nathaniel's, which had stopped coming after the first day, which worried me more than any of the missed ones ever had. "It's complicated, Bug. It's really not," Elliot said, in the tone of someone who had given up trying to explain long division to a golden retriever. "But okay." It lasted 5 days. On the 6th, I heard cars pull up outside, and a voice through the floorboards that made my stomach drop straight through the mattress. "Hide," I hissed at Elliot, who was midway through a chicken tender, and shoved him into the closet with the tenderness of a man defusing a bomb. The door opened without a knock. I dove under the bed like my life depended on it, which, given the general vibe of the last 5 minutes, it might have. "Come out," said a voice, flat and dangerously quiet. I did not come out. I lay very still under a stranger's dust bunnies and prayed to every god currently on shift. "Mom," came Elliot's voice from the closet, sighing like the world's smallest disappointed parent. "Come out, traitor." Absolute traitor. I army crawled out from under the bed, dust in my hair, dignity somewhere back in Seattle, and looked up at Nathaniel Sinclair, who had clearly not slept, whose tie was loose and whose eyes were bloodshot, and who looked, for the first time since I'd met him, less like a titan of industry and more like a man who'd been genuinely, quietly terrified. He didn't yell. He didn't even ask why. He just crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled me up off the floor, and held on so tight I could feel his heart going like a drum against my ear. Behind him, Lawson quietly steered Elliot and a very confused bakery owner out into the hallway, murmuring something about giving the family a minute, and for once in his professional life, didn't bother pretending he wasn't relieved too. 5 days, Nathaniel said into my hair, voice rough in a way I'd never heard from him. I had every road east of the pass checked. I sat in your closet at one point, because it still smelled like you. I am not. I don't do things like that. I don't sit in closets. That's genuinely the saddest thing I've ever heard. I mumbled into his shoulder, and felt him huff out something that might, on a more emotional man, have counted as a laugh. You saw the article, he said into my hair. Maybe there is no merger. There is no marriage. Preston got into my car because he wouldn't get out of the way of the door, and I had a board meeting in 11 minutes. He pulled back just enough to look at me, and his voice cracked, just slightly, on the next part. You scared me. Don't do that again. I panicked, I admitted. I'm not great at trusting people not to leave. Something in his expression went soft in a way I hadn't seen before, the ice cracking just enough to let something warmer through. I'm not people, he said. I'm yours. I would love to say I had a witty response to that. I did not. I just stood there, dusty and ridiculous, while my husband held on to me like he had no intention of ever letting go again, and somewhere behind us, Elliot emerged from the closet with the last of the chicken tenders and said, "Can we go home now? I have homework." We went home. And this time, when Lawson mentioned there'd only ever been one room made up for us in the east wing of the estate, I didn't fight it. Living in the same space as Nathaniel Sinclair turned out to be its own education. The man had a well-documented aversion to mess, to clutter, to anything out of place. Milo's memories confirmed it was practically a phobia, and yet somehow, within a week, I'd colonized half his closet with mismatched hoodies, left crumbs on his side of the bed twice, and once fell asleep using his shoulder as a pillow, so thoroughly he'd had to work one-handed on his laptop for an hour rather than move me. He never once complained. You have a system, I told him one night, watching him fold a sweater with military precision. I have standards, he corrected. You let me leave takeout containers on your desk. I let you leave takeout containers on my desk, he said, like the distinction mattered, and it took me an embarrassingly long moment to realize what he meant by it, and when I did, my whole chest went warm and stupid. Elliot, for his part, adjusted to our new domestic arrangement by weaponizing it. Within days, he'd figured out that if he mentioned my snack run demands loudly enough at dinner, Nathaniel would simply deploy Mr. Pruitt to run interference, which meant every afternoon involved a rotating cast of fried chicken, bubble tea, and Elliot's personal favorite bit, delivered with a completely straight face, a can of some off-brand strawberry milk called Lucky Cow that he swore up and down was the good stuff, and which I drank anyway because arguing with a 6-year-old about brand loyalty felt like a battle I could afford to lose. There was, too, the afternoon I dragged Nathaniel out of the office under threat of Elliot's tears, entirely staged, entirely effective, to a bubble tea shop 2 blocks from Elliot's new school, the kind of place with beanbag chairs and a wall of hand-drawn menus that had clearly never seen a man in a $3,000 suit walk through its door before. Nathaniel stood in line looking deeply, genuinely lost, staring at a menu board like it was a hostile takeover negotiation. Get the taro, I told him. Trust me, I don't know what taro is. Nobody does. That's part of the charm. He got the taro. He also, 3 sips in, admitted, grudgingly, like the words physically pained him, that it was good, and then spent the rest of the walk home pretending he hadn't said that at all, while Elliot walked between us, slurping his own drink and looking, for one entire unguarded block, like an ordinary happy kid, instead of a boy who ran his own household budget. You have boba stuck to your tie. Elliot informed him somewhere around the 2nd block, with the flat satisfaction of a boy delivering very bad news very well. Nathaniel looked down at the small brown tapioca pearl clinging to $300 of silk like it had personally betrayed him. "Handle it," he said to me, entirely serious, and held the tie out slightly, as if I were some kind of on-call boba removal technician. "I'm not your dry cleaner, you're my husband. It's basically the same job. That is not remotely the same job." "It is today," he said, and didn't move an inch until I'd actually flicked the pearl off with one finger, at which point he nodded once, satisfied, like a man who'd just successfully closed a very small but important negotiation. Elliot watched the entire exchange with the weary patience of someone who had long since accepted that both of his parents were, in their own separate ways, deeply ridiculous. There was also, memorably, the backyard incident. Bo came by one Saturday with a bag of marshmallows and a truly reckless disregard for fire safety, and between the two of us we managed to set a section of Aunt Deborah's prized hedge maze, imported, apparently, at outrageous cost, smoldering before Mr. Pruitt arrived with a garden hose and the exhausted energy of a man who had clearly done this before for someone. It was Elliot. Bo and I said. In unison, the second Nathaniel's car pulled into the driveway. Elliot, 6 feet away, did not even look up from his book. "I accept my fate," he said, with the weary grace of a boy who had clearly given up on either of us ever being reliable adults. Nathaniel looked at the smoking hedge, looked at the two of us standing there, covered in soot, and sighed so deeply I thought he might deflate entirely. But when I caught his eye, there was the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough that I counted it as a win. There was one more public appearance before the season properly turned, a fundraising dinner at the Seattle Art Museum, black tie again, the kind of event where Nathaniel's presence alone made half the room recalculate their quarterly projections. I'd gotten better at these by then. I knew which fork to use. I knew not to call anyone by the wrong title. I even, God help me, knew how to make small talk about defense contracts for 4 minutes without giving away that I had absolutely no idea what any of it meant. Preston found us near the dessert table, because apparently Preston Vale operated on some kind of homing signal tuned exclusively to Nathaniel Sinclair's location. He was solo this time, no Corbin trailing behind, dressed in something pale and flowing that probably cost more than my old car. "I heard about the hospital," he said, soft, sympathetic, aimed entirely at Nathaniel like I wasn't standing right there holding a plate of tiny desserts. "That must have been terrifying for you." "It was," Nathaniel said. "Milo handled it better than I did, honestly." He tried to negotiate his hospital stay down using ruptured appendix leverage. It didn't work, but I admired the effort. I nearly dropped my dessert plate. It was, as far as I could recall, the single funniest thing Nathaniel Sinclair had ever said in front of another human being, delivered with the same flat, dry cadence he used to close mergers, and it landed like a perfectly aimed dagger straight through whatever soft, tragic mood Preston had been building. Preston's smile faltered. He tried once more. Something about how he'd always understood Nathaniel best, how 6 years of friendship had to count for something, and Nathaniel just looked at him, unmoved, and said, "Understanding someone and being married to them aren't the same thing. Preston, you'd know that if you'd ever actually tried the second one with anybody." He didn't wait for a response. He took my elbow, steered me toward the terrace, and left Preston standing alone by the Petit Fours looking, for the first time since I'd met him, like a man finally starting to understand he'd lost. "That was mean," I told Nathaniel. Once we were outside in the cool night air, the city lights spread out below the terrace like something out of a postcard. "Was it inaccurate?" "No," I admitted. "Just mean. I liked it." "Good," he said, and pulled me in against his side, chin resting on the top of my head like it had become a habit rather than an occasion, because I intend to keep doing it. I hadn't forgotten what Mr. Pruitt told me that first week, that Elliot's birthday had never once been anything more than a card left on his pillow. So when the date rolled around that fall, I spent 2 weeks plodding behind Nathaniel's back with a level of secrecy usually reserved for corporate espionage, roping in Bo, Lawson, and eventually Mr. Pruitt himself, who turned out to have an entire hidden talent for balloon arches he'd apparently never once been asked to use. Elliot came downstairs that morning expecting the usual quiet weekday, and instead found the entire backyard, the same one that would later host our wedding, the same one that had already survived a marshmallow-related fire, strung with lights and banners and a truly excessive number of balloons in every color Bo owned pants in. There was a cake-shaped, at Elliot's own secret request relayed through Lawson, like a bank vault, complete with a tiny fondant $sign on top, because my son, God love him, had priorities. Nathaniel stood at the edge of it all in his usual dark suit, looking almost as stunned as Elliot did, like he genuinely hadn't clocked that this was a thing families were supposed to do every single year. You didn't have to, he started. I absolutely had to, I said. Every kid deserves at least one day a year where the whole world is embarrassingly, obnoxiously about them. He's had 0 of those. We're catching up. Elliot didn't cry, because Elliot Sinclair did not cry, as a matter of established personal policy. But he stood very still in the middle of that ridiculous backyard for a long moment, looking at the cake and the balloons and the small, strange assembly of people who had all shown up just for him, and then he walked over and hugged me around the middle so hard I nearly lost my footing. "Thank you," he mumbled into my shirt, quiet enough that I don't think he meant for anyone else to hear it. "Every year," I told him. "Non-negotiable. I already told your dad." Nathaniel, behind us, said nothing, but when I glanced over, his eyes had gone soft and a little too bright, and he cleared his throat twice before he trusted himself to speak again. Not everything that season was chicken wings and hedge fires, though. It was Elliot who tipped me off, without meaning to. I caught a flash of a scrape on his shin he was trying to hide while helping him change for bed one night, and when I asked, gently, what happened, he clammed up so fast and so completely that I knew, with the sick certainty of a parent, because that's what I was now, whatever the paperwork said, that something was wrong. It took 2 days and one very careful conversation to get it out of him. Kids at school. A teacher, Ms. Whitfield, who decided early on that Elliot's quiet, careful manner made him an easy target, and who let the other kids follow her lead. He hadn't told anyone because, in his words, "You already have to deal with enough." I sat with that sentence for a long time after he fell asleep, a 6-year-old managing my feelings for me. "Not on my watch." "How long?" I asked him the next morning, as gently as I could manage. "Since before you got here," Elliot said, not looking up from his cereal. The old Milo cried a lot. I didn't want to be one more thing. He said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a second to register how much it cost him to say it at all. "You're different now, though. I don't know why, but you are. I'm always going to want to know," I told him. "Even the bad stuff. Especially the bad stuff. That's the deal now." He studied me for a long moment, the same evaluating look his father gave board members right before a decision, and then very quietly nodded. I showed up to the next parent-teacher conference in the nicest thing I owned, hair done, looking every inch like trouble in expensive shoes, and I did not raise my voice once. "You've been targeting my son," I said, once we were alone in the classroom. Miss Whitfield's composure cracked around the edges. "He's a difficult child to reach. I've done nothing wrong. You've done nothing documented," I corrected. "There's a difference, and I'd be very careful about which side of that line you want the school board to find you on." "He's a difficult child," she said again, when I didn't back down. "Sensitive. Withdrawn. Frankly, some children invite the reactions they get. He's 6, I said. There is no version of 6 years old that invites being singled out by the adult who's supposed to be protecting him. You had one job in that classroom, and it wasn't picking a favorite target." She sneered, actually sneered, the audacity, and said something about how I was clearly just another kept spouse playing dress-up, throwing my weight around because somebody finally gave me a credit card. I want it on the record that I did not lay a single hand on that woman. I simply had, at that point, an extremely candid conversation with the principal, the superintendent, and, once Nathaniel found out, which took him roughly 4 minutes, the entire school board, 3 of whom sat on committees the Sinclair Foundation funded. Miss Whitfield did not return the following semester. I celebrated, appropriately, with an entire pint of ice cream eaten standing over the kitchen sink at 11 at night, which Mr. Pruitt found me doing, and did not comment on beyond quietly setting out a spoon that wasn't bent. I'll admit there was one incident that same week that ended slightly less diplomatically, when Beau and I stumbled onto a group of older kids cornering a smaller girl in an alley near the mall, filming it for laughs. There is a version of that story where I handled it calmly. That is not the version that happened. Between me hollering something about the responsibilities of citizenship and Beau physically inserting himself between the ringleader and his phone, we ended up, once again, in the back of a squad room, across from an increasingly exasperated Officer Dean Foster, who by that point recognized me on sight and simply sighed instead of reading me my rights. Again, he said, dropping into the chair across from me with the specific exhaustion of a man who had genuinely hoped never to see my face in this building a second time. In my defense, I was doing a good thing. You say that every time. It's true every time. This isn't even the first time I've had to explain to you that being right about something doesn't automatically make it legal, Officer Foster said, pinching the bridge of his nose like a man praying for patience from a god who had long since stopped listening. That sounds like a personal problem the justice system needs to work out, not me. He stared at me for a long moment, then flipped his notepad closed entirely. You know what, forget it. Bo already gave me the whole story, unprompted, in more detail than I asked for, complete with a reenactment. I believe you. I always believe you. That's the annoying part. You always let me go, too. That's because your husband owns the building the precinct's charity gala gets held in every year, and I would like to keep my job. Foster dead, entirely without shame, and waved me toward the door the second Nathaniel showed up, silent and furious, and radiating enough quiet menace that the entire precinct seemed to collectively decide paperwork could wait. You could at least look a little sorry, Nathaniel said, once we were back in the car, though the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was trying very hard not to be amused. I am sorry. I'm sorry that kid's phone survived the whole ordeal completely intact when it absolutely should not have. You threw it in a fountain. I threw it in a fountain gently, I said. There's a difference. I have principles. Bo, from the back seat, leaned forward just enough to add, for the record, it was a beautiful throw. Very clean form, I'd give it an 8. It's not a sport, Bo. Everything's a sport if you commit to it, Bo said, and Nathaniel exhaled the specific, long-suffering sigh of a man who had somehow ended up responsible for both of us, and drove the rest of the way home in silence, one hand steady on my knee the whole time, like he had no intention of letting either of us out of arm's reach again that night. I ended up in the hospital myself not long after. Nothing dramatic, just my appendix finally staging its long-overdue rebellion. And it was there, groggy and stitched and thoroughly done with the whole ordeal, that things finally properly tipped over. Preston showed up to visit. Which would have been generous of him, if it hadn't turned out he'd checked himself into the room next door, under suspiciously theatrical circumstances the same week, coincidentally, and if Corbin hadn't been caught, by Lawson, trying to plant a story with a tabloid about how the stress of Milo's hospitalization was, obviously, driving Nathaniel back toward his true match. Deborah showed up too, uninvited, trailing Preston like a chaperone, and the whole thing came to a head in my hospital room with all 5 of us crowded in, me half upright in a paper gown with 0 patients left. Nathaniel standing sentinel by the bed, Deborah in full offense mode, Preston working up a truly impressive set of tears, and Corbin lurking by the door like a man calculating his exit. I think it's time somebody said something true in this family for once, I announced, to the room at large, and immediately followed it up with a chicken wing joke so badly timed that even Nathaniel had to fight a laugh before I got serious. You've been playing Wounded Flower for 6 years and it worked on everyone but me, so drop it. Preston's tears redoubled. Milo, how can you be so cruel? Cut it, I said. You know exactly what you tried to pull, both back when we were kids and this week. Deborah rounded on me next, chin lifted. How dare you speak to me that way in a hospital room when this whole family has spent 6 years being generous enough to let you stay? Generous, I repeated. You've spent 6 years making sure I knew exactly how little that generosity was worth, and you did it in front of a 5-year-old more times than either of us can count. So here's the truth for once. I don't need this family's charity. And I definitely don't need a lecture on belonging from the one woman in this house who spent 6 years reminding everyone she isn't actually part of it either. Feel free to update your seating chart. The room went dead silent. Even Corbin looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. Preston, apparently deciding tears weren't landing, tried one more angle, voice trembling toward Nathaniel. Nate, after everything, all those years, doesn't that mean anything to you? Nathaniel looked at him, genuinely looked, for a long cold moment, and said no, just that, one syllable, flat as a closed door. Then he turned his back on all 3 of them entirely, and sat on the edge of my hospital bed, like the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. Careful with your hands, he said to me. Quiet, checking the IV line like it personally offended him that I'd been hurt at all. No more running off. No more parent-teacher smackdowns without me there. No more diving under beds. That last one was a highlight. Personally, the corner of his mouth twitched again, closer to a real smile this time, dangerously close. And behind him, I watched Deborah usher a devastated Preston and a mortified Corbin out of the room without another word. The fight gone out of all three of them at once. Once the door clicked shut, it was just us. He sat there a while, just watching me, the machines beeping their steady rhythm in the background, and for once in his 6 years, not mine, he didn't reach for his phone, didn't check the time, didn't do anything except exist quietly in the same room as me like it was enough. "You've been different since the day you woke up," he said finally. "Sharper, funnier, braver, honestly, in ways I don't think the old you ever let himself be. I told myself for months it didn't matter why. I just didn't want it to stop." "You should know something," I said, because apparently my appendix bursting had loosened something in my chest along with it. I'm not really the Milo you married. Not entirely." He didn't look surprised. "I know," he said. "I've known since the day you woke up different. You're not freaked out?" "I stopped being freaked out the day you defended my brother's honor by insulting Deborah's plastic surgery," he said, and I laughed so hard it pulled my stitches. "Tell me your name." "Your real one, Milo," I said, weirdly enough, Milo Cross. Different last name, same terrible luck with Buffett's. Something in his face went soft and open in a way I'd never seen on him, not once, not even at the gala. "Milo," he said, testing the name like it was new even though it wasn't. And then he leaned down and kissed me, slow and careful, like I was something worth being careful with. When he pulled back, his eyes, I swear this happened, had gone from that flat, storm cloud gray to something warmer, something gold at the edges, like a light switching on behind them. "Was that supposed to happen?" I asked, a little breathless. "That's the bond," he said, low, like it embarrassed him a little to admit it. "It doesn't do that unless it's real." "Well," I said. "Guess you're stuck with me." "Good," he said. "I was planning on it either way." The tabloids ran a real headline a month later, this time with an actual photographer invited and everything. "Sinclair CEO finally holds wedding ceremony for longtime husband. No mystery merger, no confusion. Just Nathaniel, in a suit that fit him even better than the first one I'd seen him in, and me, in the nicest thing I've ever owned, and Elliot standing between us, in a little matching vest he'd picked out himself, looking for once, entirely unbothered by anything at all. It was a small ceremony, held in the same garden where Nathaniel would later spend 3 years losing quiet arguments with rose bushes, string lights strung between the trees, because Elliot had vetoed anything he called too fancy for a backyard, which was, notably, his own backyard. Bo cried through the whole thing and denied it immediately after, loudly, to anyone who would listen, while still visibly wiping his face on his own sleeve. Lawson took approximately 400 photos, all of them somehow perfectly composed, despite his hands shaking with what he insisted was professional enthusiasm. Mr. Pruitt allowed himself one single dignified tear, dabbed away with a handkerchief that matched his suit precisely, because of course it did. Deborah came, sat quietly in the 3rd row, said nothing unkind to anyone the entire afternoon, and left before the reception, which from her counted as an apology, and possibly the nicest thing she'd done for me in 6 years. Preston did not come. Neither did Corbin, whose attempted tabloid leak had, once Lawson finished quietly documenting it, resulted in a very firm and very final conversation with the Sinclair legal team. The last I heard, Corbin had relocated to Portland to pursue other opportunities, and Preston had, of all things, taken up violin again seriously, touring with a small chamber ensemble that Bo swore, with great relish, was doing fine, but not like Seattle Symphony fine. I found once the dust settled that I couldn't muster much anger toward either of them. Mostly I just felt sorry for anyone who'd spent 6 years chasing a door that had never once opened for them. Elliot walked me down the aisle himself, insisted on it, wearing a little vest he'd picked out entirely without help, and carrying, inexplicably, a can of Lucky Cow strawberry milk in one hand the entire time for tradition. And I will go to my grave insisting that was the single, funniest, and most touching thing anyone did that whole day. I turned to Nathaniel somewhere in the middle of the first dance and said, "For the record, I still think you should have told me sooner that the merger thing was fake." "For the record," he said, spinning me with a competence that suggested he'd definitely taken lessons for exactly this occasion. "You should have called me back instead of buying bus tickets." "Fair. I love you," he said, plain and simple, no dramatics. The same flat certainty he used to close billion-dollar deals. And somehow it landed harder than any grand speech could have. Yeah, I said, grinning up at him. I know. Try to keep up. He did, for the record. He kept up for the rest of the night, through Beau's disastrous toast, through Elliot falling asleep mid-cake with frosting on his cheek, through the two of us slow dancing badly on the same patio where a hedge maze used to stand, long after the string lights had started to feel like the only light left in the world. 3 years later, the garden had gotten out of hand, was the thing. What had started as Nathaniel's one modest concession to Aunt Deborah's ruined hedge maze had grown, over 3 years, into a genuine obsession. Rows of roses he pruned with the exact same focus he used to bring to hostile takeovers, a small vegetable patch he refused to admit he'd named, and, memorably, one entire corner devoted to sunflowers, because Elliot had asked for them once, offhand, at age 6, and Nathaniel Sinclair had apparently never forgotten a single request that child ever made him. Absolutely not, I said, staring at the can of milk Elliot had just set on the kitchen counter with the reverence of a man presenting a holy relic. It's the good stuff, Elliot said, now 9, taller, and somehow even more insufferably composed than he'd been at 5. It's a knockoff brand from a gas station and you know it. It's tradition, he said, and I had genuinely no response to that because he wasn't wrong. It was, horrifyingly, tradition. Beau wandered in from the backyard, wearing a shirt the exact color of a highlighter, trailed by Nathaniel, who had a smudge of dirt on his cheek and the particular look of a man who had just lost a very serious argument with a rosebush. Aunt Deborah's hedge maze had never fully recovered from the great marshmallow incident, and in its place now stood a garden Nathaniel had, against everyone's expectations, taken up as a genuine hobby, mostly because it was the one place in the house where nothing could talk back to him except the occasional aphid. We're up to level 1940, Beau announced, waving his phone at me like a trophy. Candy Crush. Just so you know where we stand. I'm at 1941, I said, without looking up from the fridge. Beau made a sound like a wounded animal, declared the game rigged at full volume, and stalked off toward the den to recalibrate. A few minutes later, he reappeared in the doorway, phone held aloft, face triumphant. Level 1942, he announced. I'm ahead, officially. Somebody witnessed this. I want it on record for future arguments. I'll believe it when I check myself, I said, already reaching for my own phone, and the two of us disappeared down a 15-minute rabbit hole of increasingly petty accusations of cheating, while Elliot rolled his eyes so hard I worried, briefly, for his optic nerves. Elliot, from his spot at the counter, did not look up from the milk can he was still defending. For the record, he said, I've been keeping an independent log of both your scores since March. Neither of you is as far ahead as you think you are. Beau and I both froze mid-argument. You've been what? Beau said. Auditing you, Elliot said. Somebody has to keep this family honest. He finally took a sip of his milk, entirely unbothered by the two grown men now staring at him in mild betrayal, and added, almost as an afterthought, You're both cheating, by the way, just not each other. You're each cheating yourselves out of admitting the other one might actually be winning. Neither Beau nor I had a response to that, mostly because it was, infuriatingly, accurate. Pruitt appeared with a tray of lemonade, nobody had asked for, but everybody accepted, setting it down on the patio table with his usual quiet precision before pausing, just for a second, to watch the four of us. 5, if you counted the very real possibility hovering in Elliot's folded proposal, occupying every corner of a house that had once felt, by his own quiet admission months earlier, entirely too big and entirely too empty. It's good to have a full house again, Mr. Hayes, he said. Then, catching himself, with the faintest twitch of something that might, on a less composed man, have been a smile. Mr. Sinclair, I mean. Force of habit. Either one works, I told him, and meant it completely. Nathaniel came up behind me, wrapped an arm around my waist, and rested his chin on top of my head, which he'd taken to doing so often I'd started building extra time into my mornings just to accommodate it. You look happy, he said. I am happy, I said. I live in a house with a 9-year-old accountant, a rosebush-related restraining order, and a husband who once threatened an entire family reunion into silence for me. It's a good life. Speaking of the family, he said, carefully casual in the specific way that meant he was absolutely not being casual, Elliot's been asking about a sibling. I turned around slowly. Has he now? He's drawn up a proposal, Nathaniel said, and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, an actual, itemized proposal, complete with a projected budget and a section labeled room allocation, in Elliot's careful 9-year-old handwriting, footnoted no less, with a citation for average nursery furniture costs he'd apparently pulled from an online retailer. I looked at the paper. I looked at my husband, who was doing an extremely poor job of hiding how much he wanted this. I looked at Elliot, hovering in the doorway, pretending very hard not to be listening, and Bo, still muttering about Candy Crush from the hallway, and Mr. Pruitt already quietly refilling the lemonade pitcher like he'd known the answer before any of us did, and the whole ridiculous, warm, impossible life I'd landed in after a hash brown accident in another universe entirely. "Fine," I said, "but he's doing the budget for this one too." Elliot, from the doorway, did not smile. Elliot Sinclair rarely smiled outright, but something in his shoulders eased, warm and pleased, and he said, "Obviously, somebody has to." Nathaniel laughed, a real one, rare and low and entirely, permanently mine, and kissed the top of my head, and outside the window, the garden he'd planted kept right on growing, stubborn and a little wild, sunflowers turning their faces toward the light, exactly like the rest of us. If this one had you laughing through the chaos and a little wrecked by the end, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we've got a brand new villain to happy ending story waiting for you every single week. And hey, drop a comment telling me, Deborah, Preston, or Corbin, who would you have roasted first? See you in the next one.